launch you. Anyway, in deference to Shane and his father, who was a dear friend of mine, even though I didn't quite agree with all his politics, we appeared on numerous platforms together. One of the most moving things in the book is your tribute to your father, and I'll say a little bit more about that. McThomais, the late McThomais, who delighted us with so many wonderful books about Dublin and was such an authority about it. Well, may I say, first of all, I really am delighted to be here, and Peter, who is an old friend of mine, and his mother was one of my dearest colleagues in the Friends of the Library in Trinity, I think in a way was too modest about this place. This is a place of world significance. And I think I'm right in saying that it got a kind of a global award and I think it's wonderfully innovative, because the stories of the dead are interesting, and it's referred to in Peter's very interesting introduction as the great necropolis of Dublin, and even the history of its origin is fascinating. A little bit shaming to me, as a member of the Church of Ireland, that it started off, was provoked by an incident when a Protestant sexton interrupted the attempt of a Roman Catholic priest to say a shortened version of a Requiem Mass. If apologies were of any use, I would apologise. On the other hand, a bit earlier than that, one of my collateral ancestors was adopted by my direct ancestors, who were Anglican. It was his parents' wish that he should be brought up Roman Catholic. They honoured that in the height of the penal laws, and he became a celebrated bishop and founded the Brigidines and the Patricians. So we all have this wonderful mixed background. But this is, as I say, a superb book, full of stories, full of humour, full of information, full of the most glorious photographs. And I'm delighted that we have representatives of the Kavanagh family here from the Gravediggers. And look at that. What a haunting photograph. And later on, there's a really beautiful photograph of Glasnevin in the moonlight. You know, so the illustrations are also simply wonderful and beautifully and appropriately chosen. So I'd like to congratulate Shane and also Mercier Press for producing such a beautiful book. And how much is it? Because you gave this to me free. How much is it? $12.99. It's $12.99, and nobody leaves this room without one. He will sign them, and that makes them more valuable. Now, I say that it's a fascinating book, described in the introduction as leisurely and entertaining, but it doesn't just talk about this cemetery. It also introduces a series of cemeteries, including one that I've never managed to get into. It's always intrigued me. And it's a little Jewish cemetery at the end of Ballybong. And has, is it 5618? I mean, it's a Jewish calendar. And I've always ached to get in and see what it was like, because it's so interesting that the Jewish community in Ireland go back to such an extent. The last burial there was the beginning of the 20th century, I think. So we get a photograph. So even though it's quite difficult, I think, to get inside it, you can see what it looks like, and you get a little history of that aspect of our multifaceted life. And it starts with the coffin of a young boy from Francis Street in Dublin in 1832. That's a hell of a long time ago. And Peter was saying to me before the wonderful meal that we had, and thank you very much for your generosity, and we had marvelous conversation as well. There's some superb leather-bound volumes in there, which are the records of the burials for that period of the best part of 200 years. And since the destruction of the records in the Custom House, these are extraordinarily important historical records. I don't know if any of you watch Who Do You Think You Are? Have you seen that? Well, I mean, some of us probably saw a couple of nights ago John Hurt, who was hoping that he was descended on the wrong side of the blanket from the Marquis of Sligo, but turned out he wasn't. But looking at him, I have a fair suspicion that he was, anyway. But this is among the kind of records they looked at. And it is fascinating to be able to do that. And just as an aside, may I say, I was on the Late Late Show with Ryan Tubridy in the middle of the presidential election and so on, and he grilled me, and afterwards he was kind of in a clammy sweat, and he said to me, you know, I had to do that. And I suppose I saw the way the ratings were going, and I knew you were going to have to sort of stick that I've been so soft on everybody else. I said, but you're bloody lucky that I didn't do the same too, because I know the skeletons in your closet. He went to colour that tablecloth, and he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I was watching Who Do You Think You Are? And I know exactly who you are. I said, I remember your old grandfather quite well. Tony Adams going down all the railways and was out in 1916. But it emerged through that you, sir, are a direct descendant of Edward III, King of Britain. Whereas Her Gracious Majesty Queen Elizabeth II is a direct descendant twice from Brian Boru on both sides of the family, and once from Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. So the headlines the next day should have actually read, British royalty shows Irish rebel princess round Dublin. And this is the kind of wonderful stuff that you can get from the records. But they're not all about former chairman of CIE. One of the most moving is Sean Foster. And I put a note as I read it, how does he know? Because at every Easter I spent a few moments thinking about the men and women who made sacrifices during those 5 days in 1916. You thought about Constance Markovich and Paul Revere and all this, but then for Easters to come, I'm going to take a few moments to think about poor little Sean Foster, his mother Catherine, his uncle Joseph O'Neill. And they get all these details. How the hell does he know? Is he making it up? And then you get this thing, well, he is a genius. But he met Terence O'Neill Sr. Who's here tonight. But I hope to meet him and shake his hand. Because it is one of the most poignant and human stories about a small child who was killed, and it does not even clear which side the bullet came from. Could have been a ricochet, a casualty, the inhumanity of war. And this gentleman who is with us here this evening told Shane that story. That I think was the most moving, and it's illustrated by a photograph of the little boy and his rocking horse. I mean, that would really almost move you to tears, I think. And then you discover things like, where does the word dead ringer come from? I won't say dead ringer. Well, I don't want to tell you. Buy the book and find out. Father Brown, a Jesuit from my own neck of the woods, in a sense, by adoption on both our parts, because I think he was in Belvedere. And then this wonderful artist with the camera. He died in 1960, and he was 2 years older than James Joyce. Just imagine that. So if the parallel obtained, Joyce should have lived until at least 1962. He died in 1941. And of course, Joyce is mentioned because of various connections with the cemetery, including the caretaker and Mr. O'Connell, who I discovered this evening from Peter was a descendant of Dan, who is one of my great, great heroes. And there is, of course, the mausoleum here. Then the firemen, Exide batteries exploding on Pierce Street, and then setting the next door place on fire, and then the tragedy of 3 firemen, who are such heroic people, and it happened recently in Bray as well, if you remember that tragic thing there, and found only when they discovered a little bit of holes that had been melted, and that led them to the charred bodies. Bold Coulthurst, but I'm going to pass over him, because it was a pill, a young man who shot Squeaky Shufflington, and then there's Captain Boyd. The Requiem Mass was held in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I thought, well, was that New York? And I asked him, no, it's the one I go to, the Anglican one. I'm glad he had a Requiem Mass. I'm having that too. That would distress the Protestant element. I don't care. Because I regard myself as part of the Universal Catholic Church, and I'm having a Haydn Mass and well larded with our aim. But I won't be buried here. I'll be buried in a wonderfully obscure graveyard in Roskelton, in County Laois. Now, the Huguenot graveyard, Huguenot cemetery. How wonderful. I mean, these were people who were persecuted in France for their religion. They came over here, and the good thing about them was they regretted and I think objected to the treatment of the Catholics here. And until about 1829, the services were held in French in the Lady Chapel in St. Patrick's Cathedral. So it's a lovely connection. Then Liam Whelan. I mean, so much of their sport. I remember that. I remember the day of that crash, Manchester United, wasn't that it? And Liam Whelan is still alive, because you still hear his name being invoked when people talk about the game of soccer on the radio. And then the lockout. James Larkin. Now, there is one of my heroes. is he here? Well, I mean, he's not here. May I tell you something about that? The other day, and please don't let this go out of the room, you're only photographers, not reporters. That's all right. I have lunch when I call the Works Canteen in Leinster House, and the other day, first of all, in came John O'Connell, not the John O'Connell from the cemetery here, but the man who jumped out of Labour and landed in Fianna Fáil and then became Minister for Health, and quite a good Minister for Health, followed by Ben Briscoe, the second Jewish Lord Mayor, followed by Catherine McGuinness, and the pièce de résistance, the coup de grâce, was the emergence of Frank Feely. Do any of you remember Frank? Yeah. So I couldn't resist. I went up to Frank and I said, lovely to see you, Frank. Did I miss something? And he said, like what? And I said, well, like the last Trump. But it seems to me as if every grave in Dublin has opened up and is disgorging its contents. When I see, first of all, Catherine McGuinness, then yourself, then John O'Connell, and then Ben Briscoe, and he wondered should he laugh, and then he thought perhaps he should. And you know, I do think that in the midst of grief, there is always also some laughter. But John Nolan was the person that principally features here because it's about the lockout. And that wonderful speech of Larkin, the great appear great because we're on our knees, let us rise, and the statue in O'Connell Street, that rhetorical, just Brendan Behan. That's one or two funerals I was at here. I remember it very well. And I remember the Oakley and Heron lads with the berets and all this and the tricolour, well I can't remember all that, but, and I remember there was a huge crowd. The service was in Donnybrook Church, because he and Beatrice lived in Ashley Road. And one of the priests who was celebrating the thing or performing the ceremony was getting more and more irritated because everybody's trying to have a go. You see, they were pushing forward. And the back of his neck got more and more red, and eventually he said, any more shoving and I'll push the Lothians into the grave after. And I thought that Brendan would really love that. And the other funeral I was at, and was the funeral of your father. And I remember that because Ken Monaghan, who sadly left us, was there with me. And as we left, we did a tour of the graves, and I think it's very exciting to learn that there's going to be a connection between the Botanic Gardens, so that people will be able to go through. I saw a stone. Now that is very, very unusual. And it fascinated me, because in my mother's family, there was no Gaelic Irish family, there is a legend that a stoat will appear at the burial of the head of the family and recognize the heir. Well, in 1937, when Barney Fitzpatrick, Lord Castlebar, died, a white stoat emerged, ran along the coffin, jumped on the shoulder of somebody from London, who turned out to be his illegitimate son. And that's not made up by me. It's actually recorded in the, I think it's the Leinster Express. So it was lovely to see a stoat in the twilight. Now, I think the saddest of the unmarked graves. I think that is really awfully sad in Mount Rome. And I do deplore the sectarianization of certain aspects. I think the people in Bethany, for example, Bethany Homes, there's an enormous, over 200 people from a Protestant orphanage. I think people think that the Prods never did anything nasty to the children in their care. Oh yes, they bloody well did. Yeah. And I mean, I was in an appalling Protestant boarding school before I made my escape from that forced elementary high school in Harcourt Street. I think these people deserve recognition. I really do. Because it is just so sad. I've discussed about well, no, I laugh at the